I think it saves flute players money, even though it's more expensive. And it makes the flute play a lot better than it ever did because of the weak tone generator and the precise seal. It lets you play with a lighter pressure, gives you faster technique. It's more precise if your fingering is not clean. It lets you know that. In other words, they're sort of cruel. They're saying, hey, this is not clean enough. But it gives you that feedback, and you clean that up, and then you sound fantastic.
Hello, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 11, an interview with David Straubinger. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. David Straubinger is a recognized flute and pad maker. He, his wife Dale, and their son Joel run the Straubinger flute business in Indiana. Today, we are talking with David about his musical and business background, how to select a flute, and flute maintenance. Please help me welcome David Straubinger. Hi, David. Thank you for being on today's show.
Hello, Heidi. Good morning. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Oh, of course. I definitely want to pick your brain on some topics that you are a professional in. And the first is, I'm curious how you got into building your own flutes and your own pads. And if you can discuss your musical background, that would be great.
Well, my musical background started back in elementary school, of course. And like most people, I started on flute and started playing oboe also in high school and got more serious on oboe. Ended up studying at Butler and then going on to Juilliard. And then I ended up playing with the Indianapolis Symphony and had done that a number of years. And when I first joined them, they had a short season, 36-week season. And we were off in the summer, and some of the players drove dump trucks and painted in the summer and did things like that. And I got a job working for Indianapolis Public Schools at their repair department. And my earlier background, I did a lot of mechanical things. Like in high school, I rebuilt Linotype type machines for a friend that owned a newspaper in El Cajon, California. So mechanical things were easy for me, and I went right to repair and really enjoyed it. And in 1970, I decided to start my own repair business. And at that time, we did all the woodwinds and brass even. And I started narrowing down. And what I noticed was I could do repair on all the instruments and people would be happy for a long time. But flute was different. And I feel fortunate to live 50 miles north of Indiana University, which is a major music school there. And I did a lot of work for the students, flute players there. And I noticed what minute little leaks affected them, and they noticed. And I started studying it and realizing flute is the weakest tone generator of all the instruments, so that leaks affect it more than any of the others.
Oh, interesting.
Not that the others like leaks, but with flute, there's no diminishing returns. It just keeps getting better. And students were getting brand new high-end flutes in their first early years of college. And they'd come up to me. I'd get a phone call. They said, it's a brand new flute, and it just needs minor adjustments. And I would see it and think, to get what they want to accomplish, I started developing some techniques on tone hole shapes and other mechanical things, grommet heights and spud heights, and how tight the screws hold the pads in, and things like that, that I saw as a detriment to a good sealing flute. So I started changing a lot of these things and improved the felt pads quite a bit, but didn't feel like it was still accomplishing or the goal where I wanted to be. It was always like when you do an overhaul or do a repair on a flute, you were never done. At some point you have to say, okay, this is it. But I never felt finished, where on the other instruments, the job was done. And one day I came up with an idea on making pads so they're more secure, more precise, seal better, and go the direction of using the traditional skin and felt. So I made designs around that and got eventually 7 patents on this. Well, the proof is in the pudding, I guess. We've been here quite a while.
Definitely.
And the business keeps growing, so that's proof to me that it works. I also, after I designed the pad, I started looking for synthetics to go that direction. And a good friend of mine, his name was Carlton Sperati, and was one of the main persons that developed Teflon for DuPont. And he was a flute player and also the conductor of the DuPont band. Back then they all had bands. And so he was quite helpful in sending me materials, all kinds of materials. And I finally came to the conclusion that the skin that we use comes from cow's intestines, is the best option. So anyway, here we are.
Wow. So how did you get from building your own pads then to making your own flutes?
Well, I guess I did it backwards. Usually people start making their own flute first, but I made a pad and then needed a flute to put it in. Back then I was doing some work with the woodwind brass wind and the owner, Dennis Bamber. And he had close ties with Armstrong. And we started a project, about 100 flutes that I private branded, put my own name on. And I tell people I hot rodded them. So I took these cheaper flutes and upscaled them. And back then we sold them for $850. And I see the same flutes now selling for a couple $1,000s.
Oh, wow.
But we sold 100 in 1.5 years. And it got me going. And then I went up to Elkhart to show them my new pad, and they basically laughed at me and kicked me out of the office.
Oh, no.
Because of the price of the pad that they were paying at that time. I think $1.50 per set per 15 pads. And I was asking $6 a pad.
Oh, wow.
So you can see the difference there. And going to convention, I would show my pads to people, and they'd ask the price. There's a lot of machining, a lot goes into the pad. And I said, well, it's $6. And they say, oh, that's way too expensive. And I said, really? I said, how often do you take your flute in for adjustments? Oh, every couple months.
Wow.
And do you send it from here to Boston or here to somewhere? Yes. And how much does that cost you? And I said, what if you reduce just one of those? What if you only had to send it out once a year? How much would that save you? And I said, does the pad sound expensive now? And that was my argument. And that's our goal.
That's a great sales pitch.
It's true.
Yeah.
My goal was, I asked myself, what would I pay for a pad that did da-da-da-da-da? And I said, would I pay $2? Would I pay $3? I finally came to the conclusion that the price was not the issue. Not that you can't be ridiculous about the price, but I put the idea of price out of my mind, so it opens your mind up to think of what options there are. And this is what I came up with.
Wow, that's really cool.
And I think it saves flute players money, even though it's more expensive.
Right. No, that's great.
And it makes the flute play a lot better than it ever did because of the weak tone generator and the precise seal.
Oh, sure.
It lets you play with a lighter pressure, gives you faster technique. It's more precise if your fingering is not clean. It lets you know that. In other words, they're sort of cruel. They're saying, hey, this is not clean enough. But it gives you that feedback, and you clean that up, and then you sound fantastic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that background. And
Sorry, it got sort of lengthy.
oh no, that's good. I like it. It was really good information. So as an educator, as a flute teacher, I've every year gone into flute shops to help my students purchase their first flute or a step-up flute or even a professional instrument. So going through those three categories, what features should the flutist and the teacher be seeking in the beginner flute?
Well, they'd want to play it, and I certainly would recommend that they go in with a teacher, because so often the parents have no idea of how to approach it.
Exactly.
And the salesman has a flute to sell, but it might not be the right flute for them. Not that it's a bad flute, but maybe not the right flute for them. First of all, it should feel comfortable in their hands. If they're a small person, weight is an issue.
Yes.
They should blow the flute and feel comfortable on it, and try a lot of flutes. Don't try just one or two. If they can press lightly, I suggest to all players, even professionals, to check their flute, go down the scale, start at the top and press the next key down as lightly as possible, and see that it seals and gives a nice clean sound. If you press a little harder and the sound clears up, the adjustments are out. And that's something that's important on a student flute. You're not going to get the precision that you do on a really high-end flute. But it's important to have the keys. You might check the keys and see if there's any side wobble or play. And the G sharp is always a good one to tell, because you can take the spatula and move it up and down towards the head joint or towards the foot joint. And if you feel a click, I know Asian players come in and that's the first thing they'll see as they check the G sharp. And if there's a bit of click in that, the smallest bit, they put the flute down and say thank you and walk on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so even on a student flute, those are important. I don't know, you as a teacher might have a different bent on this than I do, but I see students with a closed hole flute and maybe a nice flute, a Haynes or something like that, and they want to get a better flute, so they go to another student flute company to buy an open hole. I find that they get themselves in trouble, because the open holes, if you're getting an open hole flute, I think you need to go up to a $3,000 or something above that, because the mechanical aspect of that, the grommets get put in and they're sometimes too tight, pressed down to pull the skin down too tight, which doesn't help the adjustments, and they're almost impossible sometimes to get out. You end up tearing the pad, so it's hard to adjust the flute. The closed hole ones are easier to adjust and keep in adjustment.
Oh, interesting.
So, I could see a teacher's desire to get an open hole to train the students to cover the holes, be more center on the holes. But the mechanical aspect is a little more difficult.
Oh, I did not know that.
And like I say, I would go into a little bit more expensive flute if you're getting an open hole flute.
Oh, okay. So that's a really great tip for the step-up flute then to consider when in the flute shop.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then for the professional flute, you mentioned it in the beginning with the mechanism and the sealing. Is there another feature that the flutist should be seeking?
Well, the precision of the key certainly is important. And with Straubinger pads, it requires a really tight mechanism, totally free, but absolutely secure.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I would check the weight to make sure you're comfortable in playing the flute. Try a lot of different head joints. I see players testing a flute and they don't get the head joint in the right place, so the flute's out of tune with itself.
Right.
So what I recommend, and you probably do too, is play the low C and overblow it an octave.
Okay.
And then play the regular same octave fingered correctly. So you're testing the long flute and the short flute.
Yes.
And if you're sharp on the regular fingering, pull it out a little bit and get those in tune. The flute will play a lot better and be a lot more resonant when that's done.
Okay.
Also keep in mind, when you put a head joint on a flute, if it's not fit properly, it's not going to give you the ultimate. You can get a good idea of how it works for you. You can put Scotch tape on one side. I don't recommend putting it around, but you want metal to touch metal.
Okay.
It's more important to get the vibration connection from the top to the bottom.
Mm.
Key heights are important, but you'll notice when you play the flute, if it's not resonant enough, it could be the simple thing of adjusting the key heights.
And the key heights also contribute to the intonation of the flute.
It does, that's right.
Okay. No, that's good.
But when you're buying a new flute, those are certainly considerations that you would think would be taken care of at the factory, and they usually are. There's a lot of good flutes out there, and the question is, what's the right flute for your student? And playing it, you'll find a match. It's matching the head joint to the flute and the head joint to the player and getting all three of those connections working. And when it's right, it's almost magical.
I agree. So as a professional flutist, going into a flute shop and seeing oodles of instruments to play, it can be quite overwhelming to decide what instrument, because they can put you in a room and say, here's, 20 instruments, and that can be overwhelming. But for me, one feature or one step to take in the right direction is determining a budget beforehand. And then that it narrows down the search quite significantly. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, if the budget is a concern, it's important to maybe check out flutes on either end. I'm thinking about a woman that came in with her daughter. She was raising her on her own. And it was always, she was having trouble. She came in with a car that was barely making it, but she wanted to do everything for her daughter. And I had directed him into I didn't even talk about our flutes because ours are rather expensive. But I talked to her about one that was in the $2,000 or $3,000 range. And the mother asked me, said, why is yours so expensive? What's the difference? And so I tried to explain about the sound and the flexibility of sound, the intonation, and other aspects. And she said, well, let me go home and think about it. And I was sure she was going to buy this less expensive instrument, which was a nice instrument. It just wasn't the same as ours. And she came back and bought the expensive one. But so the point is, you can make a budget, and it's good to know where you're focusing. It may not be a new instrument. There's a lot of used instruments that are great that would fit better in your budget if you're on a tight budget. Even if a flute is one that you like and feels like if you bought it, it would need an overhaul, you can spread the overhaul out to a later date, pay for the flute now, and then spread your expenses out, so it helps.
Oh, that's a really good tip.
People that sell flutes used don't overhaul them for that point, I think, is that, if they're still playing and limping along, doing okay, it keeps the price down and makes it possible for somebody to buy it that wouldn't otherwise afford it.
Oh, I see. No, that's great. Another thing that I noticed when I was flute shopping was one of my very first professional flutes, the scale was not good. I mean, I could not play anything in tune. So you mentioned, the long note versus the short note, and we're talking about harmonics. So there are a lot of different flute scales out there. The Bennett scale, Cooper scale. Can you talk about that? Because intonation for me as a flutist is very, very important, because if I can't play in tune, then the instrument's not good for me.
Well, the Cooper scale is considered a pretty fine scale right now. And the Bennett scale is improvements on those according to Bennett. And I'm not saying that it's wrong. It just depends on how you play. And he finds certain notes that are out for him on the Cooper. We're talking about pretty subtle stuff. And he puts a little clay in this note or that note to lower it. And that's certainly something that can be done. I've done that myself for players. But you want to find something that's pretty close to what you can play.
Okay. So in terms of scale, what it's built on, is there a particular measure like 440, 442 that's better or worse, and just your opinion on that?
Well, I'm an oboe player, and I think we should play at 440.
Right.
But if we make a flute that plays at 440 and the scale creeps up to 442 or 3 or 4, you're going to be out of tune. If you make a scale at 442, you can play at 440 and you won't notice the difference, and you can play at 444.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like a happy medium.
Yeah, nobody's going to go down below 440.
Right. No, that's good.
Playing, if you're sharp, you can get away with it, and when you're flat, it sticks out like a sore thumb.
Right.
So the scale tends to creep up a little bit rather than down.
Okay. No, that's great. And when you get all flutes into your shop for repair, what's a common issue with these flutes that are coming into your shop, and what can we as flutists do to prevent less issues and less damage to our instruments?
Well, first of all, we do mainly high-end flutes, so people take pretty good care of them. But we certainly do see sometimes major damage. And there's a few things that I would suggest people not do. And I'll see if I can name some of them. One is when you're packing the trunk of your car, don't set your stuff down on the ground with the flute and then pick it up and put it in the trunk. Take the flute and put it in the trunk or the back seat first, and then take your clothes and put them in the trunk, because you can run over your clothes and it doesn't do too much damage. You run over your flute, it's not so good.
Right.
If you have a carrying rack on your car, some people like to set the flute up there before they pack things. And it's not so nice when you drive down the highway and realize your flute's on top of the car.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things that have happened. That's what I'm relaying.
I remember picking Jonathan Keeble up from the airport to get to the Texas Flute Society's festival that year. He was a guest artist. And I remember putting his suitcase in the trunk and asked if he wanted his flute bag to go back there. And he said, no, what if we get rear-ended? I thought, oh man. So he had his flute and his whole bag like sitting in his lap, and he was holding it like a baby. So, yeah.
Jasmine Choice plays one of our flutes. And when she drives with the flute, she always has it in her lap. But yeah, that's certainly a consideration. If you have it in the trunk and get rear-ended, you lose a lot. The other thing is you never put it on a sofa or on a chair. Places you would sit down, places you would lay down. Put it on top of a bureau drawer, but if you lay a towel over it, somebody else can come in and not see it and swipe the towel off, and the flute goes on the ground. Stands, I realize sometimes if you're playing piccolo and flute, you need a stand to switch back and forth. But at the break time, intermission, you don't want to leave the flute and the piccolo on those stands. It's just too dangerous, and I've fixed a lot of bent flutes that were on stands. If you're teaching, a stand is handy, but if you have a studio where you can bolt it down or something like that because they get knocked over. If you set your flute down on a flat table where it's exposed, that's pretty safe as long as it's not sticking over on either end. If you set it on your case, the body of the flute is rubbing on the case, where if it's on a flat surface, the little rings are protecting your flute, so it's not getting little scratches everywhere. So I recommend laying it down on a bureau drawer or something in your studio where you can have it not hanging over.
And this has happened a couple times. You know, you're about to go out on stage for a gig, whether it's chamber, orchestral, solo, competition. It's happened to me in the past where, you know, your flute just for whatever reason, you know, stops working. As a suggestion for professional flutists, is there like a screw kit or some kind of like quick emergency tips or suggestions to get through that performance? I'm not suggesting, you know, us go and full out repair our own instrument unless you're licensed, of course, but just in emergency situations, are there any suggestions to help professional flutists get through?
Well, it's good to have a little toolkit, but more important to have the knowledge, a little knowledge on emergency things and how to fix them. If you have a sluggish key, sometimes just a drop of oil on the two open spots and work them in, and then wipe it back off again, the excess oil, so it doesn't get on the connections. Sometimes that will free up the key. Sometimes backing out a screw just a little bit will help, so screwdriver is helpful there. It'd be nice if somebody had a course for flutists. You could do that in a master class or something, have somebody come in and just show the flute players a little bit about their flute.
Yeah.
Have a flute they can take apart. I did that at DePauw just recently and had some students come in, and I had some junker flutes, and I said, this is how this works. Take this apart, look at this. And on a handmade flute, I don't suggest the flutists, for the most part, getting into it too much because it's very delicate and very precise.
I see. And
you can create a lot of problems, but if you have the knowledge, some people have done repair, that's a different matter, but if you've never done it, be very careful. And if you're in question, sometimes there's somebody else in the orchestra that has some background.
Sure.
Can help you.
Well, there's a business idea for you, David, to put more on your plate. Go around to the major cities and do a master class for professional flutists.
I'm good with ideas, but how to do it.
Oh, shoot. So, well, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate your knowledge and expertise in the area. Is there any other just general tip or suggestion that you want to make known or announce to the flute community? It could be anything.
Yeah, keep your flute dry.
Okay.
Yeah, water is hard on pads, adjustments.
Okay.
And we have these little cloth dabbers you can put underneath. If there's water, when you put your flute away wet, if there's a lot of water on the D-sharp key or the G-sharp key, don't let the flute sit there. If that dries and the pad is closed, then when you open the pad, you'll hear a smack, and that's the skin wanting to stick to the tone hole. Well, that tears the skin. So you want to get all the water out. If you've played it a lot, if you're doing some beatboxing, get it cleaned out. Or if it's real humid or cold and you're playing the flute when it's cold, it's going to condense a lot more.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you, Heidi. It was my pleasure.
Well, you take care and send hugs and love to Dale, and I will talk to you guys soon then.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBegay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.